It begins in the stillness of a winter morning, the kind where the palace grounds seem frozen in time. But behind the gilded doors of Clarence House, something priceless has vanished. Not money. Not jewels from the royal vault. Something far more dangerous, Princess Diana's sapphire engagement ring. And when King Charles learns who took it and why, the walls of the monarchy will shake. Stay with me, because by the time this story ends, that single stolen ring will have pulled the royal family into one of the most explosive scandals of the decade. If you think you know the story of Diana's sapphire, you don't. What unfolded in the days after its disappearance was not just about a piece of jewelry, it was about love, betrayal, and a dangerous rewriting of royal history. Keep watching, because every truth revealed here will make you question what the crown really protects. The day it happened, London was draped in a grey mist that made even Buckingham Palace look like a faded portrait. The city's heartbeat was slow, muffled by fog and the hush of snow settling over its streets. Inside Clarence House, however, silence had teeth. Staff whispered in corridors, their voices trembling with something unspoken. It wasn't until midday that the first ripple reached the king's private study, a discreet knock, followed by the words that would sour the air like spoiled wine. "Your Majesty, the ring is gone." Charles's pen froze mid-signature. He didn't look up immediately, years of royal training had taught him not to react. But when he did raise his eyes, the calm blue in them had cooled into something glassy and dangerous. "Which ring?" he asked, though he already knew. "The sapphire," the aide said quietly. "Her ring." It was as if someone had whispered a ghost into the room. That sapphire, deep as midnight, surrounded by 14 brilliant diamonds, was more than a jewel. It was the crown's most intimate scar. Chosen by Diana from a Garrard catalogue in 1981, it had witnessed the rise and collapse of a marriage, the making of a princess, and the unraveling of a fairy tale. It had been locked away after her death, protected not by law, but by silence. Charles leaned back, his mind pulling up the image of Diana's hand, slender, poised, with that oval blue gem catching the light at public events. It was not supposed to be touched again, certainly not worn again. But someone had touched it. In the long, dim hallway outside the king's study, the temperature seemed to drop. The aide, a man who had served the crown for 2 decades, hesitated before speaking again. "Sir," it was Queen Camilla. The name landed like a dropped glass. It took Charles a long moment to process, but in that moment, memory returned like a blade. He thought of Camilla at the state dinner 3 nights earlier, her hand resting casually on a champagne flute. He'd noticed her jewelry, or rather, the absence of her usual pieces. At the time, he hadn't looked closely. Now, he wondered if he should have. The report was simple: the ring had been in the locked private vault in the green drawing room. Camilla had asked the keeper of the jewels to bring it out for safekeeping under the pretext of an exhibition request. She had not returned it. The keeper had assumed it was for official purposes. But official purposes do not involve sliding Diana's sapphire onto the hand of the woman she had once famously called the third person in her marriage. That evening, the king waited in the private apartments, rain tapping against the windows. The faint scent of beeswax and Camilla's perfume lingered in the air. When she entered, he saw it instantly, the sapphire on her hand. "You're wearing it," he said, voice low. "I am. It's part of this family's history. And I am part of this family." They held each other's gaze. "You have no idea what that means," he warned. "I know exactly what it means. That's why I'm wearing it." It wasn't shouting, but a duel in silence. By morning, the first photo was online, the sapphire framed by her pale glove and faint smile. Social media erupted. Some called it tribute, others an insult. Diana's words resurfaced: "There were 3 of us in this marriage." For many, it felt like the crown wasn't moving on from Diana, it was erasing her. In his study, Charles read the coverage alone. Years spent balancing Diana's memory and his present life undone. This breach would not quietly mend. Before dawn, advisors gathered in the communications room, screens glowing with hashtags and headlines. Suggestions came: call it a thoughtful homage or say nothing at all. Silence works on paper, in life, it curdles. The king passed by, shoulders steady, but inside he was a winter sea. Some crises arrive like thunderclaps, others like breath on glass. This was the second kind, about memory, and memory refuses control. Still, the machine woke, talking points, angles to hide the ring. But cameras always find what they're told not to. By 8, a courier placed a folder on his desk, archival photos of Diana, the Sapphire, a comet of blue in each one. It felt less like a briefing and more like a summons. Camilla never spoke to the press. She spoke to the mirror. Her dressing room was orderly, lit softly, the ring glowing like private midnight. She told herself this was reclamation, not erasure, that the ring was part of the family's thread, and locking it away only embalmed a wound. But another truth whispered back, Diana's voice, clear as ever, there were 3 of us. Camilla slid the sapphire on. It fit as if it had been waiting for her. The feeling was not triumph. It was gravity. In the hallway, a footman looked away too quickly. In palaces, the smallest things register first. He did not summon her for this one. He simply walked into the room where she stood, watching rain track down the windows in thin silver lines, and closed the door without a sound. The air was lemon polish and beeswax, and somewhere the faint sweetness of honey from the jars a gardener left as a gift each winter from the royal hives. The king had always liked that bees making order from 1,000 wild flights, a golden ledger of labor and light. He looked at her hand. It's not an ornament to arraign, he said, voice low, as if talking too loudly might wake something sleeping between them. It shouldn't be a relic to a ghost, she replied, and her tone wasn't hard. It was tired. When you wear it, he said, you move hands that are not yours. She held his gaze for a long, unblinking beat. Every hand I lift in public is measured against a memory. There is no movement that is mine. He studied her, and for a moment the anger eased into grief so plain it felt indecent to witness. There is a peculiar, lonely cruelty in being compared to the dead. No matter how kind the comparison, it has no mercy. But the ring, this was not a metaphor. It was an object with weight, and the weight was gathering. He did not ask her to remove it. The request would be a command, and commands have a way of breaking what they purport to bind. He only said, this will not end where you think. That afternoon's engagement had been planned for months, a literacy initiative in a rehabilitated warehouse, all exposed brick and hopeful banners. Children's books lined the walls, colors loud enough to fight the weather. Reporters gathered in a careful half-moon, microphones bristling with foam windscreens like hedgehogs. As they stepped from the car, the taste of cold metal hung in the air. Flashes stuttered. The choreography began. The room buzzed with chatter, paper rustle, and a rolling hush as royalty entered. Camilla smiled with practiced warmth, Charles remained polite but withdrawn. Then a child offered her a picture book, and as she reached for it, the sapphire flashed, blue as deep water. Cameras lunged for the shot they'd been waiting for. The image spread instantly. The ring became the headline, a provocation to some, a sacrilege to others. In homes, offices, and taxis, people argued, the old grief roaring back. That night, Charles retrieved a brown paper-wrapped box from storage. Inside, a charity program, a pressed forget-me-not, a cassette in Diana's handwriting, and her leaky fountain pen. He carried it to the garden, smelling of wet earth. He didn't play the tape. The flower crumbled in his fingers. Objects anchor memory, he thought, until you cut the rope. Whispers spread, a driver claiming Camilla held the ring with fear, not pride, a joke in Parliament that fell flat, a scrapbook owner unable to paste in the new photos. On the palace server, a file appeared, Sapphire press monitoring. In the long gallery, portraits looked on as Charles confronted her. This is not rain. This is a barb, he said. What are we if we can't move an object from the past into the present, she asked. We are custodians. Forget that, and we break what can't be repaired. It isn't only your grief, she replied. He asked once, please. She closed her hand around the ring and left. 2 days later, headlines used the word stole. The palace stayed silent. The ring kept appearing in windows, cars, at tables, sometimes so dark it looked like a bruise. He turned to the chapel, where candle wax held the memory of prayer. Sitting alone, he he removed his signet ring, a small rebellion against the mark it had left for decades. When the door opened again, it was not Camilla. It was his son. The air quivered a fraction. Neither man moved quickly. The chapel asked them not to. They did not speak for some time. When words came, they were rationed. "You know what it means to them," the son said finally, the pronoun sheltering more souls than grammar can hold. "I know what it means to me," the father said. He did not look up. "And to us." "The ring was promised," said the son, but not as accusation. As a ghost of an old plan. Promises are tricky in families. They are made between people who change, in the presence of objects that don't. The father closed his eyes and saw a small hand reaching for a box it could not yet carry. "We must not turn mourning into spectacle," he said. It was not about headlines now. It was about knees on cold stone. They left without plan or pledge. Sometimes a solution is simply the absence of more damage. Days later, a worn brown envelope arrived from Diana's former dresser. Inside was a cornflower blue silk scarf, one corner frayed. A note read, "She wrapped it around the ring box when she traveled, for luck. Perhaps it should not sit in the dark." He held the scarf to the light. It smelled faintly of lavender. He slipped it into his pocket, the silk warming quickly. Committees met to decide the ring's fate. Proposals ranged from museum display to commissioning new jewelry for the Queen. No one suggested she keep wearing it. The meeting ended without decision. In the palace's honey room, the air thick with waxen summer, a beekeeper explained how bees find the same flowers in changing fields. Holding a jar of amber, Charles thought of the monarchy rebuilt through small, steady work. He placed the scarf beside the jar, the colors making a quiet treaty. A plan took shape. A draft statement was written, speaking of custodianship and deep respect. It was perfect for television, but hollow for the heart. The true statement would be an act, not words. On a cold morning, he unlocked the green drawing room vault. He wrapped the ring in the scarf, added a pressed forget-me-not in Diana's leaky fountain pen, then closed the case. It was a private act, an ending and a mercy. In the corridor, Camilla waited, gloved and composed. He gave her a matching scarf. "It should not sit in the dark," she said. "It isn't," he replied. Weeks later, a discreet museum exhibit opened, dedicated to Diana's work. In a glass case, a velvet ring box sat wrapped in silk. The label read only, "Personal Effects." People lingered longer at that case than the curators had predicted. Some because they knew the story and wanted the confirmation of a shape in silhouette. Some because they didn't know the story and were comforted by the warmth of the blue. In the gift shop, forget-me-not seeds sold out before noon. Outside, on the steps, a girl about 9 held a packet in her mittened hand like a promise she understood without language. On his desk lay sheets of thick paper embossed with a crest that seemed heavier this week. He began a letter. It started 3 times, each time differently. "I am sorry. I have failed. I have learned." He left all 3 beginnings on the page. He did not polish them. He let them coexist. Some apologies require a chorus to sound true. He wrote about stewardship and about the temptation to rewrite memory, not to wound the dead but to salve the living. He wrote about hands and rings and the way objects sometimes carry more current than men can safely hold. He did not sign it. He folded the paper and placed it in the box with the cassette. Perhaps someday he would send it to no one, which is to say to everyone. Spring arrived like a sudden decision. The yews developed a green haze, and the gravel regained its appetite for footsteps. He walked the path with a gardener who did not attempt conversation. They stopped by a small plot where a new scatter of forget-me-nots made a sky on the ground. He knelt, and the suit cuff darkened with damp. He pressed 2 fingers to the soil as if taking a pulse, and for a second he imagined the ring beneath, wrapped in silk, ink drying into an old stain, doubt dissolving into the grain of the wood. He looked up and saw her at the far end of the path. She had come without announcement, and he did not rise immediately. There was no theater left to play. She approached with measured steps. In her hand was a small brooch, new, modern, a sapphire of a different cut, surrounded not by diamonds but by a ring of tiny pearls the color of morning. She turned it once in the light. "We commissioned this," she said. "It is not that ring. It never will be. But it is something we can wear without borrowing anyone else's breath." He nodded. The approval was not magnanimity. It was relief. They stood together long enough for the sun to find their faces. At a hospital opening weeks later, she wore the brooch on a pale jacket that did not invite comparison. A woman in a wheelchair reached for her hand and clasped it, and in that clasp there was no blue, only skin and pulse and a pair of eyes that had seen too much news lately and were grateful for something unremarkable. Cameras captured the moment and tried to ascribe to it meaning, a reset, a gesture of healing, a lesson learned. Sometimes a clasp is only a clasp. But sometimes that is everything. He watched from 3 steps away, and for the first time in months, his chest did not feel like a locked drawer. Sleep came late. He returned to the chapel, not for words, but for the kind of silence that rearranges a man's rooms. He lit a candle, and the flame found its small kingdom. He thought of the dresser's note, of the silk's worn corner, of the leaky pen bleeding just enough to make every signature an admission of humanity. A monarch's work is public. A man's work is done at night, with witnesses that do not speak. He took from his pocket a seed packet, the ones from the museum shop, a whim he'd allowed himself in a moment of generosity toward his own sentimentality. He turned it over in his hand and read the planting instructions as if they were scripture: shallow soil, consistent light, patience. He smiled, an expression half memory and half plan. In the morning, he telephoned the retired dresser. The line quivered with the small ocean between them. He thanked her, not for the scarf, but for the sentence. Perhaps it should not sit in the dark. It never did, she said. Not really. He ended the call and stood for a time looking at the handset as if it were an old lighthouse. Then he dialed another number and spoke fewer words. After he hung up, relief settled in the room like dust caught and gentled by sunlight. A car took him to a place the public would have approved of, but the public was not invited. A lake, a small island, a walk with stones that remembered a lighter tread. He did not lay flowers. He did not speak to the air. He sat on a bench and placed the seed packet beside him and let the wind argue with it. In his palm he held nothing. He closed his fingers anyway, and the shape of the ring pressed into his skin like an absent star. He stayed until the light went apricot and then thin. The scandal did not vanish, scandals become sediment. They line the riverbed and alter the course. People still argue in kitchens, taxis, offices. The words soften. The edges do not. In the museum, the silk-wrapped box glows quietly behind glass. Visitors lean in and study their own reflection alongside the object and emerge looking older by a minute. A curator dusts the case each morning with a cloth so soft it can only be trusted to the most patient hands. In the palace, the honey jars leave for hospitals and schools and neighbor kitchens. The labels carry the year's small weather. A child spreads a spoonful on toast and tastes, without knowing it, an essay on persistence. In the garden, the forget-me-nots do what they were named to do. Months later, on a rainless evening when the city exhaled the day's heat through open windows, he returned to the study and opened the box one more time. He lifted the unsent letter and, rather than signing, he underlined a sentence in pencil: "We keep what we carry, we honor what we cannot keep." He slid the paper back and closed the lid with the gentleness reserved for sleeping children and ideas just beginning to live. Down the corridor, footsteps moved in the calmed rhythm of a house that had learned, for now, to breathe. In a small bowl on the desk, a brooch, small, gilded, almost a toy, caught the late light and returned it not as spectacle, but as a quiet insistence that some work is done in the daylight and some in the dark, and the best work leaves behind no bruises, only warmth. Outside, the city took inventory of its lights. Inside, 2 people, no longer at war with an object, began the careful labor of walking together through a room that had stopped echoing. The scandal would live on, yes, because this is how empires catalog themselves, in blazes and embers. But the ring wrapped in silk, kissed by ink, guarded not by glass but by intention, had been returned to the one place where history does its most honest work. Not in the headlines. In the keeping. And when he finally turned off the lamp, the darkness felt different, less like an absence, more like a resting place. The sort of quiet that follows a storm, not because the wind has exhausted itself, but because someone, at last, has closed the window. The room held that quiet, gently. It lingered, unafraid of morning. Like and subscribe for more updates about the royal family.